Stanford University.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson, known to students at the University of Chicago and NYU law schools as the Libertarian. Make that the Libertarian. Richard Epstein has established himself as an expert in constitutional law, contracts, corporate law, real estate law, torts, labor law, and even Roman law, a field in which he is reputed to possess more knowledge of the Justinian Code than anyone since Justinian. The Peter and Kristen Bedford Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Richard Epstein will soon be publishing his newest book, The Case Against the Employee Free Choice Act. Richard, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Segment 1. What's going on? The AIG bonuses. Speaker Pelosi plans to introduce legislation that would tax at 90% bonuses awarded to executives of any company that received $5 billion or more in federal bailout funds. Would such a measure be found constitutional?
Well, under the law as it is today, unfortunately, the answer to that question is probably yes. You have to understand that everybody's intuitive sense of justice and intuitive sense of what the Constitution means is essentially at odds with the way in which the Constitution has been interpreted. I could recall some years ago a British man came to me and he was talking about some terrible retroactive statute that had been passed by Parliament. And he says, this kind of thing couldn't happen in the United States because you've got a written Constitution. And I said, yes. And on economic affairs, on taxation, on contract rights, on property, it has been interpreted essentially to ensure what you would call parliamentary and what we will call congressional supremacy. The question is, how do they achieve this particular result, and then why is it wrong? The way in which they achieve it is through multiple different ways. The first thing is that many of the kinds of provisions that you have under the Constitution are binding only on the states. So there's a clause which says that no state shall impair the obligation of contracts, which would mean that retroactive taxation should be bad. There's another one which talks about bill of attaiндers, which isolate individuals of a certain group for particularly harsh treatment. There's one about ex post facto laws. None of these apply to the federal government, and even if they did, they would not be read to cover these cases. So what you're left with is a combination of constitutional protections under the Takings Clause, constitutional protections under the Due Process Clause. And for those of you who don't know what they are, this is what they say. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, and no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Very broad and very general kinds of provisions. And so the first question you'd want to ask is, well, now, is a tax, in fact, a taking of property? And to the ordinary person, if the government will impose a lien on your house and seize it if you refuse to pay the tax, you're paying money under a kind of duress, and the tax would be regarded as a taking. So the WAG would come up and say that means that the income tax is unconstitutional. No, because you have to worry about the just compensation side of it. And a well-functioning government will try to match its benefits with its burdens, so the compensation that you get from the tax is in the form of public services. Well, the next question is, that's not a bad formula. How would this tax apply under that formula? Well,
how would Nancy Pelosi's tax?
Well,
right.
The answer is you're putting a disproportionate tax on a certain number of people. You're trying to do it to welch on a contract that had already been approved by the government. The benefits don't match the burdens. Supreme Court is already on to this trick, and it says that when you adjust the benefits and burdens in life under a system of taxation, there's no matching principle at all. You can take from A and give to B. All you have to do is to have a reason. What counts as a reason? Anything you can think of counts as a reason.
Wait a minute. So one of your, I was going to say a colleague. Nobody has quite the view of the Constitution that you have, but Antonin Scalia has had it up to here with legislative intent. But this is one place where perhaps legislative intent, his point is too much attention is paid to legislative intent by the so-called the liberals or the living constitutionalists. Let them pay some attention to legislative intent in this case, because it's clear, just as you said, everybody's just trying to go backwards on a contract.
Well, now, Scalia was talking about a different problem, and it's not this one. He was talking about the question as to whether or not private statements about what a bill means should be used to interpret its meaning. And he's worried about having an endless array of discordant statements introduced to take the text of a clear statute and make it muddy. When I'm talking about the disparate impact of these things, you don't even have to look at legislative intent. All you have to do is to see the mismatch. These people are not getting a single iota of additional services from the government in virtue of the additional taxes that they're now being asked to pay. They're being singled out for special treatment, and it's being imposed upon them retroactively in the sense that the Congress had already signed off on the contract.
Right.
All you need to know is special and retroactive to damn it if you're doing constitutional law seriously. But the Supreme Court has already said special taxes are fine and retroactive taxes are fine, so long as you have a quote-unquote reason for it. And well, what's the reason for it? In this case, it's to quell the popular outrage at the people who receive bonuses that the populace thinks that they ought not to get. Anything counts as a reason.
So in the analysis of Richard Epstein, the Supreme Court of the United States does not do constitutional law seriously.
Well, it doesn't do it well, that's for sure. And the reason
Okay, hold on. Let me move to a slightly different question. Some 58% of federal judges, Supreme Court and the rest of the federal bench, have now been appointed by Republican presidents, over a third by George W. Bush. What kind of difference on the federal bench will President Obama make?
He will basically, on this issue, appoint people who believe pretty much what the Republicans believe, that all economic and taxation matters are not for the courts to review under any constitutional doctrine. There'll be a bunch of other areas in which there will be a very profound difference, and on those you have to really hold your pants because you don't know what's going to go on. For example, if you're going to start to talk about racial discrimination, my own view about this subject is that we've made enormous strides in this particular area, and it's time for people to back off the coercive use of the state. And Obama, like...
You would agree with Sandra Day O'Connor?
It's enough is enough.
Let the thing dwindle down to nothing. Shouldn't take more than a quarter of a century.
Well, I don't agree with it. I mean, the affirmative action stuff is not what I worry about. What I worry about is the coercive side of this, in which you sue people for violation of the anti-discrimination laws. And we've already seen the coercion come to bear with the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which is designed to really tighten the screws on employers in sex discrimination cases. Then you look at the newspapers and you see that most of the layoffs in all age and all educational groups turn out to be men more than women. So that you do is you have this sort of congressional myth that discrimination is alive and well. They pass statutes which are based upon it, when in fact the marketplace has already turned over from what it had previously been. And a Republican type of judge would not be particularly enthusiastic about giving these statutes a broad construction. The kinds of liberal Democrats that Obama's about to appoint, I suspect, will have exactly the opposite point of view.
Segment 2, collapse. In October of 2007, the Dow Jones Industrial Average stood at over 14,000. Those were the days. By early March of this year, the Dow had fallen to just over 6,500. That's a decline of more than half. What happened?
Why does one ask a question like this of a lawyer? But I will give you some sense of...
Because I've heard you talk about it, and it's pretty interesting. Give me a shortish paragraph, because I want to ask follow-up questions.
Okay, well, there is no single cause about what this happened. The first seepage started with respect to the subprime crisis. And this was largely a function of private parties responding to government incentives, and the government incentives were perverse, so the actions of the private parties were perverse.
Government incentives were perverse, by which you mean to suggest that you buy the argument that the Fed was too easy from 2002 to 2004, roughly.
Yes. Well,
you buy John Taylor's argument.
Yes. I mean, anybody who can count and sees that the interest rates that are being charged is below the rate of inflation realize that you're getting free money when you're borrowing it.
Okay.
And if you then combine that with the situation where there'll be through Fannie and Freddie Mac and then through the various other subsidy programs, situations in which governments will basically guarantee the loan, you have easy money which gooses up the entire amount of production and the purchase of assets. And then we have guaranteed loans so that the banks who are issuing these various kinds of papers, they don't have to do any underwriting. They just know that the government's going to pay for it. So sell it to anybody for anything. And since the bubble is keeping on moving, there's no tomorrow, and people will start to buy, mortgage the properties they have, buy others, mortgage those properties, until in the end what you do is you have an equilibrium where there's no greater fool out there, at which point the entire thing starts to collapse. And when it collapses, the general rule is it goes down a lot faster than it goes up.
Listen to two quotations. Paul Krugman, Princeton economist Paul Krugman, a New York Times columnist, quote, "Regulation didn't keep up with the system, and because of the ideological environment of the times, there was no attempt to expand regulation," close quote. Second quotation, Stanford economist John Taylor, quote, "Government actions and interventions, not any inherent failure or instability of the private economy, government actions caused, prolonged, and worsened the crisis," close quote. Whose side are you on?
Well, I'm much closer to John Taylor than I am to Paul Krugman on this and probably every other question. And the account that I just gave, dealing with the way in which the Feds changed the money rate, is in fact an account of how regulation fails in some sense.
What about that 2004, I think it was 2004, the SEC
I was going to say.
Okay, go ahead. Explain that. First of all, explain the facts in that.
What happens is, I think the one mistake that the government made in this area by way of deregulation was the question of whether or not, when you're engaged in these various kinds of hedge fund swaps, you have to have certain kinds of minimum capital or margin requirements so that you can't leverage yourself so much. Leverage means having very little of your own money in this and huge amounts of borrowed. And at that time, the SEC was approached by a coalition which included amongst it, I believe, people like Robert Rubin, if I'm not mistaken, and they said counterparty security will handle this entire problem. What that means in ordinary English is if Goldman is dealing with Bear Stearns, each of them knows enough about what's going on that we can trust them to make sure that the deals are stable. And so they relaxed the margin requirements. And I remember taking a deep breath saying, why on the earth are they doing this? I know that there's more profit.
Wait, no, but you're a libertarian. Why shouldn't they do it? Why shouldn't the market handle its own risk?
Because what happens is that when you engage in these kinds of situations, the counterparties are not just the two parties to the transaction. There is a serious kind of externality that if any one of these two parties should miscalculate, its losses will be on its balance sheet, but the losses it creates to the third party down the road is not something that's likely to continue. So it's the same problem that you always get with banking, which is that you have these complicated relationships, and when one of them starts to fall, all the dominoes follow with it. And the counterparty protection takes into account some of the losses that you have to worry about, but it doesn't take into account all the losses that you have to worry about.
So what you're making is a pretty standard free market libertarian argument. Milton Friedman would have made the same argument. Externalities is one place where there is a legitimate role for the government to come in and establish rules or boundaries. Is that correct?
Yes, and the question is what kind of externalities, and in this particular case, what you're worried about is a kind of a domino effect with respect to the credit transactions going one after another, a crisis of confidence that follows. And so what happened to Bernard Madoff and what happens to everybody else is that many private plans are drafted on the assumption that you could always call your money back at any time if you get nervous with the situation. And that's perfectly good in ordinary times because the people calling back are random. But the moment folks sense that there is some kind of a serious danger inside the system, everybody demands their money out at once. The assets have been invested in ways that are somewhat illiquid, so you can't provide it. You start selling assets to the door. That then triggers drive the price down. That triggers mark-to-market regulations and so forth. And by the time you're done, you've got a run on the bank, as it were. And that's what the form of government regulation is about. So Milton, has been widely denounced as a, quote, free market economist. The irony is he was the man who really thought that the key to success in running a free market was to have a stable money system, which required very strong and purposive government action to make sure that people did not go beyond the parameters one way or another. And we fell outside those boundaries in the 1970s when, by late 1979, the prime rate was about 21% and so forth, and the long-term mortgage rate was 16%, and everybody said, oh, it's over. We stabilized for almost 30 years, and then starting with the cheap money policies and with the various subsidies, we started to lose sight of what it was that Milton had said, and all the private systems which were predicated on stability in their own internal operations failed when the central thing started to fail.
Okay. Segment 3, how have two administrations handled it? During the final months of the Bush administration, just listen to this, the Fed and Treasury cooperated in overseeing a fire sale of Bear Stearns, the effective nationalization of Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and AIG, and in bailing out GM and Chrysler, President George W. Bush on January 12, 2009, quote, I readily concede that I chucked aside some of my free market principles, close quote. Did Bush and his administration do right?
Not really. Let me sort of indicate what I think the proper approach is structurally and then how to treat it substantively.
In the early days. I want to come to Obama in a moment.
Yes, I mean, we're not going to go. The first and kind of difficult situation was the Bear Stearns situation in 2008. And if you actually looked at the terms of that transaction, it looked like a pretty standard bankruptcy situation in which the priority rules applied so that the debtors got money before the shareholders got money. And when all of the shareholders at Bear Stearns claimed that they had been given a haircut, that was a good, not necessarily a bad sign.
You're saying that Bernanke and then Treasury Secretary Paulson handled it reasonably well. They achieved a close facsimile of actual bankruptcy.
But the mistake was that they did it. And it would have been much better to have a bankruptcy clause do this
The original sin in all this was letting Bear Stearns go, not letting Lehman go down later. It was letting Bear, it was saving Bear in the first place.
Well, it was saving Bear through political means through the Treasury. What happens?
Straightforward bankruptcy, let it go down.
Well, see, it won't go down. What bankruptcy has is two forms. It has liquidation and it has reorganization.
Right.
If a concern has going concern value, that is, it continues to work in a sensible way.
Which Bear did.
You'll keep it alive in the reorganization thing, sell off useful units and rationalize the rest of the structures, and it'll be free of political complications. And the shareholders may come out with a little, they may come out with a lot. The reason why you give them pretty good marks is that when they try to do this through the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, they were trying to do what a bankruptcy judge did, and they were left relatively free of political interference. The danger is when you start getting to Lehman and everybody else, and now you're keeping it out of bankruptcy. If it's in the political arena, you're going to save some, you're not going to save other, you're going to get a lot of lobbying to see which you get to save and why. In addition to that, you're not going to be able to keep it off of Congress's desk. So if you go back and you look in the October transformation, the first of the bills, which was designed to deal with the AIG problem and so forth, was about 3 pages. It was a kind of standard bailout bill. The Republicans vetoed it because it was a giveaway. They had a point, right? By the time you got it passed a week later, that bill was 150 pages. And my favorite portion of the bailout program is the Paul Wellstone mental health and addiction provisions, which were designed to establish parity in healthcare markets and the treatment that's afforded to mental illness and addiction treatment with physical injuries. Somehow or other, that had to be part of the bailout, right? And so at this particular point, you're having regulatory chaos come into place because everybody says, oh, you want my vote on this bailout? You've got to do my favorite things. And measures that could never pass while standing alone get passed when bundled up with everything else. Right. And that's just a terrible kind of mistake. And so if you put this stuff into the bankruptcy situation, no bankruptcy judge can pass a mental health parity bill as part of a reorganization. And then you would have this outside the political system. You would salvage the good, get rid of the bad. And at this particular point, the government still has some options. If you're really worried about the way in which some of these things are working, you can infuse money to companies that are also in bankruptcy.
Hang on here. I want to get to Obama here because
yes.
So far, the new, let me give you the same.
And we haven't even gotten to GM, which is inexcusable.
Hold on. Okay, that's GM is almost too easy for you, Richard.
Yeah, it's not
so far, the new administration, Obama administration, has enacted a stimulus package amounting to almost $800 billion, proposed a budget amounting to $3.6 trillion. Working with the Obama Treasury Department, the Fed has announced that we'll take the unprecedented step of purchasing some $1.2 trillion in long-term Treasury instruments. And as we sit here this morning, Treasury Secretary Geithner has announced a public-private investment program of $500 billion to buy toxic assets. The market, by the way, is up 300 points as we begin taping. Question: how is the Obama administration doing?
Well, the single best indicator is the Dow, and notwithstanding today's burst, it's at or slightly lower than it was over the day he took office. And you have to sort of disentangle these things because some of them make a little bit more sense than others. But let's just start with the beginning. First of all, using a depression or recession as an excuse for sort of substantive regulation of the market in labor areas or in these various insurance programs is always a complete mistake. These things don't make sense standing alone. They're not going to make sense standing with everything else. Secondly, when you start looking at the bailouts, again, you have to worry about the bankruptcy type situation. The number one and easiest case to let go down the tubes is General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, if it had to. You do not want to put any money into a group of institutions which are so encumbered with pension obligations one way or another, and so encumbered with dealer obligations that they can never rationalize their business no matter how much cash you put into them. One of the advantages of going into bankruptcy is there's an orderly way to shuck, to get rid of losing contracts in order to bring the business back into some kind of equilibrium. And so we spend hundreds of millions of dollars. The only political question...
You know what, can I just, one of the common threads here in your comments about the Bush administration and the Obama administration is that they don't know enough about bankruptcy law. They don't understand. It sounds to me as though they're permitting themselves to be spooked like an ordinary layman to think that bankruptcy equals
death and destruction.
Death and destruction, exactly. It's a relatively orderly process. We have legal, this law is well known. There are bankruptcy judges who know how to do it. right?
Yeah, what we do is we take it away from experts and give it to a collection of congressional individuals who are charitably called clowns. I mean, it really makes no sense whatsoever to do it in this particular fashion. And as I look this over time and time again, I'm always struck about how it is when you bring things to Congress, it becomes politicized, and politicized decisions become destructive decisions. Now, the bankruptcy courts cannot handle the cash infusion issues, and it's a very difficult question as to whether or not you want to infuse cash into your economy. And here I have a very mixed emotions. There are certainly very respectable people like Gary Becker who said you put it in today and then you pull it out tomorrow. I'm not that confident that anyone could be a fine tuner. And
I want to distinguish here. For sure, you would accept the Milton and Becker argument that the Fed should indeed have pumped liquidity into the economy.
No.
You're not even sure about that?
I'm not sure about that, no. And let me explain why. There's no liquidity problem. We have huge amounts of cash that's sitting on the sideline right now. And, you know, in the hands of large investment bankers of tremendous sophistication, they don't want to lend. Why not? Because they don't believe that the money they lend today is going to be collected tomorrow under the mortgages that they issue. Just the reason why they're balking about joining all these partnerships that Obama announced today or Geithner announced today is because they don't think that the deal they get today is the deal they're going to have tomorrow. After all, if you welch on AIG, you could welch on anybody, and that's what they're really afraid of. So what's happened in this market, there is now a complete lack of confidence that long-term transactions will be consistently construed over their entire lives. And that's worse than a liquidity crisis, because even if you got the money, nobody wants to do anything but put it into Treasury bills.
This brings us to segment 4. My neighbor, Barack Obama.
Whoops.
Your law school colleague at the University of Chicago, your neighbor in Hyde Park, Illinois. Yeah. Quote, this is what you wrote. You've gone public with this much, Richard, from your weekly column in Forbes Online. I am quoting you to yourself. Quote, I know Obama through our association at the University of Chicago Law School and through mutual friends in the neighborhood. We have had 1 or 2 serious, substantive discussions, and when I sent him emails from time to time in the early days of his Senate term, you're the kind of person who gets to send emails to senators, he always answered in a sensible and thoughtful fashion. And yet, for assessing the likely course of his presidency, I don't know him at all. Close quote. How can you say such a thing?
Oh, it's very easy. One of the things about Obama is that he has the world's most perfect human disposition. He can sit in a room with you, he can listen to you, he can talk to you, and what happens is you really get the sense of a man who's in complete self-control. But that's the very feature that makes him so hard to read. He is so much in self-control that if he doesn't want you to know in a conversation where he's thinking, you can be there for 30 minutes and never be able to figure out what he believes. You can only have him question you about what it is that you believe. He keeps all of his thoughts to himself.
So he's Leonard Nimoy playing Spock. He's the Vulcan.
He basically knows how to keep that shield over his face. And it's almost a little bit unnerving to talk to him because you want to say, well, I agree with you, as opposed to having another question to sort of reformulate your position so he can understand it a little better. The second half of it, of course, is that the speech is completely inconsistent with the political record in the sense that as a member of the Senate, he had I guess the most left-wing voting record of anybody there, more so than people like Hillary Clinton. And that's, of course, the way in which he moves. And what I say about this is there's a side of him which I never knew personally, but when he starts saying that he was an organizer, I actually believe that he did this. And, you know, in many cases, it was tremendously constructive. You're trying to organize private-public partnerships to get homes for downtrodden people in the city of Chicago. This is not where I'm going to really start to blow my cork. But the difficulty that you get with somebody who's only worked out of that situation, he thinks that the creation of private wealth is something that government cannot influence or destroy. And so you have all of your fancy redistribution schemes, and you read every one of them up here, right? And you forgot to mention the health plan that he's put in favor of, and you didn't talk about the labor statute, which he's kind of slightly distancing himself from, but has certainly not repudiated. These are all wealth killers. And so what this guy is about to do, in my opinion, is to engage in a series of proposals that will redistribute wealth that we do not have.
From the Boston Globe, you talked to a reporter at the Globe. And
You're
the Globe,
very thorough.
And the Globe wrote, quote, Richard Epstein, who taught with Obama at the University of Chicago, rejects the suggestion that Obama is an intellectual, arguing that he merely mimics an intellectual's mannerisms, close quote.
Yeah.
How good is his mind, Richard?
Well, his mind is pretty good, but it's a clever means-ends mind. Well, he has never written a scholarly article in his entire life.
He was president of the Law Review at Harvard, but never wrote an article. He never wrote anything.
Well, if he did, it was unsigned, and it certainly wasn't going to be significant. That he never wrote anything in an academic nature. It's just not.
Would you give him tenure?
No.
At the University of Chicago Law School, you
No,
would not.
no. I mean, this is, Jody Cantor got this story from somebody, and I don't know where it was, although I have my hunches, that we had made him a tenured offer. What we did, at least the faculty, he was such an engaging fellow, everybody, myself included, would have been more than thrilled to offer him a tenure track position.
Get started,
and then
start
write
publishing.
something. Yeah, but you know, you have to, the way it works in an institution is a dean approaches somebody. That's not an offer. The offer can only come from the faculty after it's been approved by the provost and so forth. And for that, we never got there, because one of the things about this man is he has this high level of self-knowledge as anybody I've ever met, in the sense he realized he wasn't cut out for academics. Hell, I'm not cut out to be president of the United States, so we're even, right? And he therefore decided that, look, he just wasn't going to try this because it would not be the kind of thing that you want.
A headline in Politico last week, quote, "Obama tightens reins on Capitol," close quote. First sentence of the story. President Barack Obama and his allies around Washington are about to give the Capitol a bracing lesson in one-party rule, close quote. Surprised?
Nope. It's the same element. The guy is absolutely in control of himself. He's a fierce competitor. He likes to be in control of his general environment. And since his positions are not close to the middle, he sees no reasons whatsoever to compromise with the Republicans unless until they could mount a veto threat through the Senate. I think that, as I said before, he's very, very dogmatic in terms of his substantive positions. He knows what he believes and he knows why he believes it, and it's extremely difficult for people on the outside to change his mind. And the fundamental mistake of his entire worldview is that he treats contracts as devices for exploitation. He doesn't treat them as devices for mutual gain, and he assumes that redistribution can take place without any negative impact upon production. And if you live in that kind of a fairyland, which is what I think he does, every one of your major social and economic initiatives are going to misfire, and if they succeed, God forbid, in getting through, they're going to create a intensification of the downturn that we've already experienced. So, wrong guy for the job in terms of his intellectual format. The question is whether you could force him back.
Smaller point, but maybe not so small. He has a reputation as a brilliant orator. We now know that he will not give even brief remarks, the kinds of things that chief executives from Washington through Reagan through even George W. Bush would give with only a note card or off the cuff. He won't speak without a teleprompter. How come?
Well, same point. He's very much a man who wants to be in total control.
All right.
And the moment you start to improvise, you're like me, and you'll start calling the president this guy, and then you'll say, no, that's not the phrase I should have been using under the circumstance.
Charles Krauthammer described the dinner that Barack Obama attended at the home of George Will with a number of conservative journalists shortly before the inauguration. Krauthammer said that after Obama left, Will, Krauthammer, several others stayed around and talked about it for an hour or so, and they could not decide whether he was a centrist who wanted to throw bones to the left or a leftist who was willing to throw bones to the center. Which is it, Richard?
Well, first of all, the reason they couldn't figure it out is the same thing that I mentioned before. The man has this sort of stone-faced experience, and it's quite on purpose. Look, the answer is, I think, pretty clear. He's a man on the left who will, if necessary, throw bones to the center. This is not a man from the center. Some of the appointments he has may sound centrist, but again, I just don't believe in this as a serious indicator. David Axelrod is a hardcore Politico. He has much more influence on anything that Obama does than somebody like Lawrence Summers, who might have much more sense on these economic issues. How do I know that? Well, I certainly am not there for the conversations, but when I hear Larry Summers announce how it is that collective bargaining and organized labor produces productivity, I don't treat that as a statement of an independent judgment. I treat that as a sense that if the administration is really strongly pro-labor, you have to sort of throw some bones in that particular direction as an independent advisor in order to lend a certain degree of gravitas to what's happening.
Let's pursue that. Segment 5, Epstein on policy.
Okay.
The Democrats hold the White House, both houses of Congress, as you know. A couple of measures that they seem to want and your views on them. The so-called Employee Free Choice Act, which you're just talking about here, commonly called the card check legislation, which would enable unions to gain recognition without a secret ballot. Richard Epstein, once again, I quote you to yourself, Richard.
Wow.
It is commonly supposed that economic regulation is immune to constitutional challenge since the New Deal. That's not the case with this labor law. Explain yourself.
Okay, well, first of all, it's not just the card check regulation. That's the good part, quote unquote. The worst provision is probably the mandatory arbitration provision. And that's a provision which essentially states after you win your card check, There's 130 days in which you can negotiate to an agreement, the last 30 of which is through a mediator, after which a panel which is designated by the head of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, i.e. an Obama appointee through the Department of Labor, gets to set the contract for the entire business with that unit, and there's no appeal from it, and there's no standards for which the arbitration has to take place. And so the argument I made is that notwithstanding the fact that we allow everything by way of taxation and everything by way of contract regulation, the rules have always been that we will never force you into a deal that you won't want. We will only say if you want to hire somebody, you have to pay the minimum wage. We will never say, here, Peter, hire this person and pay him the minimum wage. And they've crossed that line under these circumstances. So
the card check legislation, the mandatory arbitration would cross a constitutional line.
And now the card check is a different issue.
Can I just ask, when you say it's unconstitutional, do you mean it's unconstitutional if we were construing the Constitution properly, or it's so unconstitutional that even the Supreme Court would find it so?
So unconstitutional that even the Supreme Court would find this one unconstitutional. I actually have been, much to my own surprise, what happens is you give people an inch, they take a mile. And so after a while, you get the kind of legislation in this constitutional environment that nobody would even dream of trying in a sane environment. They think, maybe I got a shot at it, but I think they overcrossed the line. And I think they overcrossed it because when they introduced this thing years ago, they never thought it had a prayer of passage. Okay. Card check's a different issue. This has to do with political participation. You can run a card check and get a union representative, and the dissenting workers who have no idea that any of this has happened. It could all be done in secret. So now you're not talking just about economics. Now you're talking about political participation in speech. Standards of review there are much higher. And so there's a question as to whether or not, if you're going to bind people, which is what you're doing, do you have to give them a chance to talk? And when they did the Wagner Act, this was absolutely critical. You had an election for the union and you had a ratification for the contract, all which had to go through some kind of political deliberative process.
Right.
So even if you're a believer in deliberative democracy, what you have to do is to look at this statute as having a hobnail boot and knocking out deliberation at the two key points in any union deliberation. And there's a very respectable argument that that process would offend the First Amendment, freedom of speech, which has been construed to cover freedom of association.
And you consider that argument compelling enough to persuade Mr. Justice Anthony Kennedy?
Well, you know what?
Which would do the trick.
Yes, well, you never quite know. I think the first one on the mandatory arbitration piece is pretty compelling. I could conceive winning 9 votes on that one. I mean, I've never met a person, when you've actually explained what this particular statute does, who doesn't look at you saying, kind of, you're kidding. You know, I have a reputation for hyperbole, and this is thought to be one of the ways in which I demonstrate it. But you read the text to them, it's relatively short, and there's really no way out of it. On the card check issue, it's going to be a little bit more tussle, but I think that there's possibly even money that Kennedy will go there. More importantly, I hope this never happens, and this is why. You put a statute like this on the books, it takes effect in this case instantly. So the unions will already have people who have signed their cards. We don't even know whether those cards would be valid if signed before the act. They're going to start the process going today. How do you try to negotiate if you don't know whether the law you're working on is constitutional? And how do you run a system of arbitration when nobody knows what the rules of the game are? I mean, you realize that they had this fiasco with the lead statutes where they put it in place. Everybody had to inspect buttons in thrift shops to make sure that there was not offending amounts of lead in it. They suspended the regulations for a year because nobody knew what they meant. There's no suspension provision here. Guys are going to enter into contracts. Arbitrators have to make decisions. There'll be thousands of decisions going on with unqualified people, and nobody knows what to do. This will be basically a convention where everybody arrives and mills around in a room, desperately looking for guys.
So this is another example of wealth-destroying legislation.
Oh, this one is the worst.
Okay. Richard, let me ask you something here. We're coming up to the end of the program, but this is a kind of outlandish. Struck me at first as outlandish, but then I began thinking about it and worried me that maybe it wasn't as easy to refute as I might have liked. Here's the notion. Lawyer and journalist John Hinderaker put up on his blog, Powerline, if the Pelosi bill, now we're back to talking about the bill that would tax away at 90% the AIG bonuses. If the Pelosi bill is enacted into law, there is no limit to the arbitrary power of Congress. In that event, we have no property rights and there is no constitution. Are we a banana republic? Close quote. Now, we've nationalized, in the past couple of months, we've nationalized major financial institutions, 2 of the 3 major automakers. The president has made clear his desire to nationalize the entire healthcare industry, 1/7 of the economy. Federal spending and federal debt have, in a matter of weeks, reached levels unseen since the Second World War. And the Fed appears to, particularly with this recent announcement that it'll by $1.2 billion in long-term instruments.
Yeah.
That's unprecedented. The Fed appears to have surrendered its independence to become a tool of administration economic policy. One institution after another being swept aside, one set of cultural and legal constraints after another being ignored. Does this make you nervous? Are we stepping in the direction of becoming a banana republic?
Well, I mean, a social democratic republic with sort of stop-go economies of the English style of 1950. I don't think of this as a banana republic because I don't think that they will break into people's houses and seize them arbitrarily or shut down the newspapers. But I do think, in effect, what happens is we will have a system of total and pervasive control over these issues, which will be an engine for, shall we say, a very serious and prolonged failure. If the economy, the characters in Washington will say, aha, this is a reason to regulate still further because we haven't gone far enough, and their basic propositions will be unfalsifiable by anything that takes place on the ground. Will there be a stop? Well, the line that I've always thought about with a constitution was the one from Madison, who said, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, meaning you want to have your political institutions organized in a fashion so that they could stand these down draughts. Separation of powers is one of the tools for slowing things down. What the founders understood, perhaps, but could not possibly design around, if every organization that you have, the president, the Senate, right, the House of Representatives, and the court, seems to be...
And the press.
And the press seem
and
to be...
And the Fed appears willing to join the parade.
And all the independent agencies, there's no break on this particular system. And the reason why I get so worried about it is, as Obama whips up this populist furor, by calling everything outrageous and so forth...
Yeah, but now, see, that's the bit where it does resemble Guatemala rather than 1950s Britain. Don't you think there's a certain, there's a feel of a cult of person? You see 2 million people on the mall chanting Obama on Inauguration Day. Does that make you nervous, or is that just too outlandish?
No, that doesn't make me particularly nervous because there was nothing particularly directed against it. That was all fuzzy goodwill. What gets me nervous is not when people are praising and hugging one another. It's when they are ganging up and attacking a bunch of people who don't know what's hit them. Could you imagine being an AIG financial techie who understands how to manipulate derivatives and being faced with this kind of a threat and saying, well, now how do I get access to explain my side to this thing? Well, the answer is the way you get access is to resign from the position. And we've already seen nobody wants to join in an Obama plan. By the way, the Geithner plan is not very good because I think there's just too much federal risk and guarantees built into the entire system. But nobody wants to work at it because they're afraid they won't get any guarantees on compensation. And this is what I would tell them. You can't get it. They could write in blood today that they're going to let you pay whatever you want to these fellows' sacred covenants. Congress could rip it up tomorrow. Because when you say that so long as you have noticed that Congress may misbehave, you have taken the risk of their misbehavior, that's what leads you very close to the banana republic. Why is it not a complete banana republic? We do that with respect to financial regulation. We don't do it to allow the police to break into your house. We could not pass today a statute which says that Congress can seize the Epstein house at 4824 South Woodlawn Avenue because he has spoken such harsh words against the current administration. So we're protected against possession, against invasions of possession, but we're not protected in terms of the way in which we use and dispose of our property. And that's a huge part of what a market economy requires, and it's what the president doesn't understand.
Last question. Yeah. If you could make one request of your old neighbor, Barack Obama, in the confidence that he would deign to grant it, what would you ask?
Find me a way to deregulate before you try to redistribute.
Find me a way to deregulate. Explain that.
What happens is deregulation will expand the pie, increase the tax revenues, bring people back into an economy. The more you can deregulate, the less need you have to redistribute. So I'm not saying you have to throw every poor person who's helpless and crippled out on the streets, but first you want to get the base expanded. And if you follow this line, it means you're going to go back to Adam Smith. You're going to have flat taxes, low taxes, moderate regulations designed to deal with bank solvency. We've already talked about that. Controls the monopoly and the provision of infrastructure. And if you do that, you can switch the stock market down, not by 300 points, but by 3,000 points overnight. And in doing that, you will solve a lot of the financial strains by getting people back to work again.
Richard Epstein, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.